Okay, it's a few minutes after, maybe we can get started. There's a few housekeeping items, and if other people join, they will catch up. So today, the webinar is scheduled for about 45 minutes. I will probably talk for about 30, I think. You should feel free to please add questions during the webinar in the Q&A. A couple of other housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so please be mindful of that. We will be able to send everybody who's registered a recording of the webinar, so you'll be able to access this later if you're not able to stay for the full session. There are other webinars that we run regularly, so there's some links here if you would like to check out other webinars. This one is really quite kind of advanced or conceptual rather than how to use protocols.io. So if you're not very familiar with the platform, you might find other webinars there that are better for an introduction. And similarly, there's a link here if you would like a one-to-one demo or a demo for your lab, etc. As we're using the webinar platform, there is the Q&A button in the bottom. So if you have a question during, please feel free to add there. It may be that Lenny, who is also behind the scenes here as a panelist, can answer some of those questions while I'm chatting, but if not, we'll try and cover all of them at the end. And just a brief disclaimer, I'm not a legal expert, so we touch on things like copyright and legal things in this webinar, but I'm absolutely not an expert, but we are led to believe that the views presented are correct. And also finally, just to thank Lenny, whose slides I've shamelessly repurposed, just updated slightly for today from a webinar he gave a couple of years ago on the similar topic. So we have quite a few things to try and cover. I've split them into three kind of subtopics, but there are sections for each. So we'll step through each of these during the webinar. First one is about sharing already published protocols. So we often receive questions about whether this is allowed, if they've already been published in a journal or if it's a modification of protocol from a company. Then there is a section that's more kind of ethics or about plagiarism. Can I copy paste sections of text? Can I enter a protocol that I didn't personally develop? How does that work? And then finally, when to share, thinking about if you're sharing protocols very early or when that might be premature, or if it's okay and how to signal that. And then finally, just touching on sharing during the publication process, so your method alongside your research article, but hopefully there's also plenty of time for Q&A. Before I launch into that, I've just put some general things, kind of insights about methods or recipes and copyright. We'll come back to this again shortly, but just to kind of actually give the answer away to a lot of those questions and give you an insight onto a quirk of copyright law. Copyright law actually expressly excludes protection for any idea, procedure, process, system, method of operation, concept, principle, or discovery, regardless of the form in which it's described, explained, illustrated, or embodied. What this actually means is that methods and recipes aren't subject to copyright in the same way that much other content is. So they are a bit different and can be therefore considered a bit differently. So copyright protection will extend only to the original expression in that work and not to the underlying idea, methods, or systems described or explained. And an analogy that works really well for this is about recipes. So there's a very interesting article, fairly recent, in the New York Times about who owns a recipe, because cookbook or recipe book authors are regularly stymied by this fact that actually the copyright doesn't apply to the recipes that are presented in those books. So US copyright law protects all kinds of creative material, but recipe creators are mostly powerless in an age and a business that's all about sharing. And I've just excerpted a few different bits and pieces here, but law views a recipe merely as a factual list of ingredients and steps rather than a creative expression. So it's very, very analogous. But then there's this concept here that the whole history of American cookbook publishing is based on borrowing and sharing. So, you know, there's a big train of thought that if you're developing these things, they're being created to share because you want other people to make the same things. Some of the cookbook authors have added permission sections, so they're really asking for attribution. If someone reuses the recipes, they want credit for that. But several cookbook writers said they didn't think about copyright protections when writing recipes. The purpose of a recipe is for someone else to make it, not for you to have some trademark on it. So I feel like it covers the whole gamut exactly the same way that we perhaps address these things in academia and different views that people have. And we have a problem within research in that methods are frequently lost. So we're probably, rather than religiously writing up our recipes, we actually often don't do a very good job and frequently bounce from one paper to another paper to another paper, and aren't always able to find the original methods that have been done during the process of research. Which can be incredibly frustrating. And the tweet here on the left is from a biologist, as you can see. That's incredibly frustrating. The one on the right is from physics. So this is across the board in different research disciplines, the same problem. And that is where protocols.io comes in. We have a very simple mission to make it easy to share method details before, during, and after publication. Okay, so back to the topic. So can I share a method that's already been published in a journal? There is, we receive a lot of questions about this, and this is an email that Lenny received a few years ago. So I have a hopefully quick question that perhaps you could help me with. I want to upload a protocol that I'm building that is a composite of several other protocols that have been published in 2 different journal articles. Some sections of the protocol may be word for word from these journal article supplemental materials, but they do not exist on protocols.io. So I can't fork them. So you can't use the original version on protocols to make a new one. Do you have any suggestions for me regarding this? Is it sufficient to cite the original protocols within our protocol, or would that still be considered some form of copyright infringement? So that's the question on this one. Is that still some kind of copyright infringement? And I kind of cut to the chase on this one already and scooped myself on the answer, but essentially no, it's not a copyright infringement because that method presentation, that recipe is not subject to copyright. So you can go ahead and add in content that's already been published somewhere else if it's part of the method. And we have more information about this online. We have a quite comprehensive frequently asked questions section, and the link is here. We'll share these slides in a bit. And this answers a little bit more information. If you are entering previously published methods, though, you really do need to cite and attribute that original source of the method where it was published before. Another take-home point here is that we've now had over 11,000 protocols published since 2014 on the protocols.io platform, and we have never had a publisher contact us about scientists sharing their methods, even if the wording is the same or similar. So this has never yet, famous last words, been an issue from any publishers being concerned about a copyright infringement issue. However, that said, for any other content like figures or discussions or tables where the presentation is exactly the same, unless the article is open access, you should not put those figures or discussions or tables in. So it's really only the methods steps that you can import like that. To the next part of the sharing already published, can we share modified protocols from a company? Again, yes is the resounding answer. We have tons of protocols on the platform that are from companies, from vendors. So if we search on QIAGEN, you can see there are 109 results in there. But some of those will be modifications of original QIAGEN protocols, and they are very happy to have that visibility through the sharing or modification of protocols on on the platform. And we actually have a good number of partnerships specifically with different other vendors. So I've put a few of them on the right-hand side here, and they're all very happy. Again, we've not had issues with any vendors to have their content be shared and protocols from the company be shared on protocols.io. In fact, with some of these partners, we have express partnerships where they want us to replicate the protocols that they have on their website on protocols.io. So the example of New England Biolabs, we have a lot of content from their site. And as you can see, some of these get a ton of visibility. So 93.1 thousand views of that highest viewed protocol that they have on there. But also you can kind of check the reuse, the bookmarks, and the downloads, and they come to us to request periodic updates on these metrics because they want to know the amount of reuse that's happening on the site. And if you go in and kind of poke around in some of those protocols, you can actually see forks where a user has come in and created a subsequent fork, a new version that they can adapt for their own purposes on protocols.io. So this one here, this Ken Christensen fork of this restriction digest, it's actually used for teaching purposes in a chemistry, taught chemistry course. And similarly, or kind of just to reiterate how much they support this, when users come along and ask questions on any of these protocols, you'll see that New England Biolabs tech support nearly always replies as quickly as they can to help users out who are trying to replicate their protocols. Okay, back now on to ethics and plagiarism. And I think as I'm kind of spotting questions popping up as I go through, and I think we're touching on some of them, but I think Lenny's also answering some of them. So what's the ethics, or is it plagiarism to copy paste verbatim protocols or parts of them? So if we go back to the email that Lenny received, it said at the start, some sections of the protocol may be word for word from these journal article supplemental materials. So is that a problem if I verbatim put text up from materials and methods essentially? So this comes up a lot on Twitter. So on the left here, this is from a few years ago, 2017, Carla tweets, "I hate writing method sections for work that is the same as previous work. Tweaking wording that works to avoid self-plagiarism is tedious." I mean, this is talking about self-plagiarism, which is often the case. You're often writing up the same method again. But as I'm going to go through just now, the same applies if it's not your previous method too. So Ginny Barber back then was, I think, president of COPE. COPE is a committee on publication ethics, which is a well-respected organization that provides support to editors of journals globally around what to do in certain instances. So back then, Ginny said, there's no reason to do that. If it's same method, use same words and reference it. It's been discussed at COPE a lot. At that point, they really had, I think, some case studies, but they hadn't formalized the wording, but this is now being updated. So I've popped a link on the bottom right to the COPE recommendation about text recycling guidelines for editors. So although these are intended to advise editors and publishers, they're actually pretty informative for researchers too, all of the guidelines on the COPE publication ethics website. And if we zoom in a little bit more, this is the kind of take home here, is that no, you do not need to rewrite the methods. What they now have formally written in their text recycling guidelines is that it may be entirely appropriate to have overlap in a methods section of a research article referring to a previously used method with citation of the original article. And I think if you're kind of questioning the ethics of this, I think as long as you have the citation in there and the credit for the person or the previous manuscript, it's entirely ethical and it's not problematic at all to reuse wording. We just make work if we expect researchers to reword things. But I guess from a protocols.io perspective, once you have the method on protocols.io, you can just link to the DOI for the protocol and you don't need to be writing out the full methods again anyway. Okay, next ethics plagiarism question is about, is it okay to enter a protocol that you did not personally develop? Are you taking credit from someone else? So I showed these tweets earlier. Anyone who's watched other protocols webinars in the past will have seen them before, but just to show that this is not, this didn't stop happening in 2017, 2018. There is some more recent tweets that I've dug out. I hate when people cite their other papers regarding a method, but then the method isn't in that paper either. I feel like I'm on a wild goose chase to get my answer. When the method you're interested in learning more about isn't actually discussed in the paper you chose to read, even though they used said method, and instead it's just cited, but when you go to citation, it's behind a paywall. Paper in 2022, method done as previously described. 2018 paper done as previously described. 100 citations later, original paper from 1963, method described with reagents you never heard of. And then the last one that I dug up. For once, I want a paper that doesn't lead me to 13 other papers for a method as previously described, damn it. So the point I really wanted to make here is that in any one of those papers along the way, if the authors on one of those citation chains, if the authors had decided to actually fully describe the protocol, they'd used a tool like protocols.io, I think many, many, many future researchers would have thanked them, and the credit could still go to the originators of the method, but also credit probably due to the person who takes the time to share it once they've actually figured out how to replicate and rerun that experiment. So we do allow this. It's really easy to accommodate this on protocols.io. So here's an example, and I'll zoom in ever so slightly. The way that we manage this is that the owner or the contact, which tends to be the person who initially imports the protocol onto protocols.io, does not have to be an author on the protocol. So you can see here that they're completely different people. Rex clearly was a former member of the Sullivan Lab, and Bonnie's a subsequent one who did enter this protocol here. The really nice thing too is that if you enter it, but you subsequently move on, that ownership contact can be changed to someone new who remains in the lab. And just a little bit more info about the differences between author and owner. The author is a permanent fixture once a protocol is published. So they'll not be able to go back and change Rex. Rex will always be the author of this protocol. But if this is a protocol that might be reused, possibly adapted over time within that lab, you could consider adding the name of the lab as an author. That would then better capture a changing author list over time. With respect to the owner or contact, initially, as I said, that's the person who enters the protocol. It doesn't need to be an author. This person, the reason I've put contact as well as owner, this is the person who would receive notifications when comments are added to the protocol. So that you want that really to be a current lab member who can therefore answer those questions as they arise if people have questions about the protocol. And as I mentioned, that can be transferred. So if Bonnie leaves and they want to transfer it to someone else, they'd be able to change that owner to someone else. So how does that work with respect to credit? The protocol citation itself is to the author. So that's what you will see under the metadata. But the person who takes the time to enter and share publicly should also ideally be acknowledged. So if you do then cite this protocol, it's probably very nice to also credit, cite the actual owner of the protocol whenever you can. And I think as a good practice when you're entering, or if you choose to enter someone else's protocol, we recommend that you'd add a note to the abstract of the protocol, which details the origin of that protocol, including citation of source of the details, if they were from personal communication, or if it was just someone else in the same lab a year or two earlier who generated that protocol. Okay, it's a whistle stop tour. I'm on to when to share. I'm trying to time check myself. Sharing early to help others versus maybe you're worried about sharing prematurely if the method's not robust or verified, and it may mislead people if you're sharing at that stage. So how can you work around that with the platform? We have some really nice functionality when you publish your protocols, in that you can select the status, the working status or not working status of the protocol, and that will be reflected on the protocol once it is published. So if you're in the very early stages of developing the protocol, you perhaps haven't optimized, or there might be a few things that you're trying to iron out, but you do want to share it at that stage, get feedback, or just make it available for other people who you know might be working on something similar. Perhaps they can help you with tweaks and optimizations. You can publish and select this in development protocol status. And once published, that will be reflected on the protocol itself, and it will stay in development. We have some just text that's in this details on the left here. We are still developing and optimizing this protocol, but if you want to edit that, you can edit that to whatever's appropriate. But then when you mouse over the in development, it will give you that status of the protocol, so anyone can see what you've said as an author about that protocol. That works exactly the same way when you check the working button and publish your protocol. It will then show up as works for me. This is really nice functionality because it's actually also a button that other users can click if they manage to reproduce and replicate the experiment. So in the case of this, Steve Henikoff, quite famous protocol from the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center, there are 47 other users who've come along and actually said, yes, this also works for me. So they used that pro forma text, we used this protocol, and it's working. So you can, with confidence, know that the people who've generated and uploaded that protocol have it working. It's going to be hopefully fairly reliable and stable, robust protocol to use. And then finally, I don't have the click, but we also have other. This is a catch-all for any other circumstances that may apply. And it doesn't, I think, get used that often, but when it does, it can be really helpful, especially if you're thinking about sharing protocols that you've been working on and you just can't get to work, or for some reason aren't successful. So in this instance of other, you would see this if you moused over it, but just for readability, I've gone to the metadata tab where you'll see what's written under protocol status. Oops, we attempted to genetically transform S. robusta, but did not succeed. This collection provides protocols that we used to arrive at the transformations, and everything included should work. Under guidelines, you can find the plasmids that we attempted to use for the transformations. So I think real credit goes to these researchers for putting all of the content onto protocols.io, even though it wasn't successful for them. But perhaps over time, someone else will be successful and can come back to them to give them insights into what perhaps they could change to make things work. And then the final part of the topics is about when to share during the publication process. So these days, there's often sharing ahead of time. We have preprints, we have lots of other things going on. But for the method, when should I share the method relative to the article publication? Should I worry about scooping or a journal rejecting my manuscript if the method is shared before submission? So that's another of our frequently asked questions. And the short answer, which is given here, is that when we have the protocols on protocols.io, they're essentially very much like a preprint if they're ahead of the journal publication going up, and not a formal prior publication. So in the same way that you post preprints to bioRxiv or any other preprint servers, and nearly all now, I think, journals won't penalize you for that. In the same way, sharing your methods on protocols.io won't disqualify you from publishing the paper. And if you're not quite ready to make it public, there's a variety of different ways that you can share with a limited set of people to keep it slightly more hidden until you're ready to share it. With recent challenging public health times, I think we've all seen a massive benefit to sharing early and openly, though, for coronavirus related methods, etc. There is a longer answer that's linked to from that FAQ, which is a nice write-up from members of one of our open groups about why and how to share and why it's worth taking your time to share the methods that way. And then just to add, I think there are over 500 journals who actually expressly encourage sharing of methods on on protocols.io or another similar platform. So here are just a handful of those, or slightly more than a handful of those. But those journals really do want you to put full details of the methods on a platform like protocols.io, because it actually increases the reproducibility of the content that they're publishing. They can have greater trust in those papers when they know that more of the methods details have been shared. And just to show you a little bit more what that looks like, this is on the left, some of the instructions to authors from PLOS Genetics. The link is at the bottom too. And in the grey box, I've just zoomed in on the slightly more relevant part, but they really support deposit of laboratory protocols in protocols.io. You can claim a DOI for the protocol, use the sharing. I'll show you in a minute how to do that. Get the DOI, and then you can drop that DOI link into the methods section of your manuscript, and we give explicit instructions on how to do that. And so for sharing privately, if you don't want a DOI and you want to be more cautious about that, you can click to share your protocol. There's a very obvious button at the top. You can either use this little chain here to get a shareable link, which works very much like a Google Doc share link. You can choose to share with specific individuals, either users on protocols.io or via an email address, or with a specific workspace on protocols.io. And you can control the permission level of access that anyone you share the protocol with has. If it's a private link, they will just have view access and won't have any editing permissions, etc. But there are all of these other options as well, to either fully publish and make the protocol like a preprint, available much like a preprint with its own DOI, etc. from the get-go. It might be indexed, it will appear in various other places, and you can just put the DOI in. You can use, currently we have this option of get DOI, which keeps it a little bit more hidden. It won't be, it won't show up on search results, it won't be indexed, but it does still get sent to Crossref because it does have to get a DOI. That's the formal location where it has to go to get the DOI. And then the final option is post a draft, which is more kind of an open science sharing option that allows it to be publicly available, but does not yet have a DOI. And you can choose to wait a while and then get DOI on a newer version. And of course, versioning is possible. So once you've published, you can make a new version if you realize you need to change something. I think I've run through that at high speed. Just to acknowledge we're a small team. Lenny's on the call, Alexia and Irina are the co-founders with Lenny. And then Nastia's brilliant customer support. If people have questions in future, and email info, it's often Nastia who will get back to you very quickly. And then a fairly small team of developers and engineers, project manager, etc. And I've popped these links back here. We can probably put them into the chat as well. I think I put them somewhere on my desktop to be able to do that earlier, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that anyone has. And I see there were a couple earlier. Okay, so would it be considered plagiarism? We covered that. Or ethical, I think we covered that. And then another question's come up, do we publish protocols in languages other than English? So this is a little tricky. We do allow publication of protocols in other languages. However, it's tricky for us to screen them because obviously we actually between the team do cover a few languages, but we clearly don't cover all languages. So what we request is that you include a translation at a minimum of the abstract, ideally in English, because it will be indexed by locations that are generally indexing English content. But also either to, if you can, make a new fork as well with a version in English, and or upload a file alongside with as much of a translation as you can manage to go with the protocol. And as I say, we screen, probably that involves us copy pasting a bit into Google Translate to make sure it looks valid, but it's fairly easy to spot when they're valid or not as well. So we do allow them but try to request content in English as well. Any other questions at all? And Lenny, perhaps if you think I missed anything, you should pipe up. Slides are shared. Oh, there's a short URL that I pasted in the chat. That should take you to the slides, I think, but double check that now. Okay, well, I was either just too fast or I answered all the questions already. If anyone has any other questions about protocols.io while we're on the call, feel free.
And I did want to add that this is Lenny. We will send the video and the slides as well with all of these links. But yes, in the chat, what Emma pasted works for me. The short URL, you just have to copy and paste it. It's not clickable for some reason. But
and I like you shared the list of all the complaints, the tweets.
there were many new ones that I hadn't seen that you found. So I need to add them to the collection.
And fun pulling those today.
But thank you, Emma. I don't have anything to add. There are some complicated things that do come up, but they're more case-by-case basis when there are disagreements between authors, right? And that you already handle on, as I said, case-by-case situations.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, perhaps we can end there, or I will stop the recording. And if anyone has any questions that they want to ask after the recording stops,